very talented, Kevin Barry.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome to the Isla stage.
Hola, buenas tardes.
This evening's conversation has been very interesting. I thought Monica said some very interesting points about barriers, and also Jorge. And I might follow up on some of those points and look at where fiction is and how we understand barriers within fiction and the community of readers around it. But first of all, given the theme for tonight, Kevin, when I say the word border, what jumps into your head? What do you think of first of all?
Well, I think for writers or musicians or artists of any type, borders are very interesting places where foreign entities rub up against each other and create sparks sometimes. In my own work, I think I'm very interested in the borders between forms, between fiction and non-fiction and memoir and the dramatic forms. And I think in art as in the world, there's a sense in this century that borders are no longer fixed entities and that have become much more fluid and are breaking down. And just as in the world, in such a state of flux around all of our borders, I think in art and in writing as well, the sense of forms been boxed away as one thing. That era is coming to an end, and everything is kind of messy and unstable and interesting because of that.
So there's more of a general curiosity, is that what you're saying?
I think so, yeah. And certainly the book we're going to talk about tonight, Beetlebone, the most recent novel, it began as quite a traditional novel, as quite almost Don Quixote, a man on a quest to find the meaning of life. And we know how those novels always go wrong very quickly. But it became lots of other things. Suddenly it became a radio play, and then it became an essay, and then it became a memoir, and then it went back into a traditional novel. But it was what I'm trying to do always, I guess, at my desk in County Sligo is I'm trying to get as much intensity onto the page as I can. I want to make my books a very intense experience for the reader at a almost at a physical level, at a visceral level. And I'm willing to dip into any form or try any technique I can to make that happen.
Before I get you to do a reading from Beetlebone, just wondering, what was the big question you were asking yourself when you were writing this book?
I guess actually the novel is about John Lennon buying an island off the coast of Mayo in the west of Ireland and using it as a kind of a spiritual retreat. And he did actually buy this island. And I suppose my main anxiety, and writing novels is always an exercise in anxiety. I think my main anxiety was, am I getting this voice right? Because it's not just any old iconic figure to put in the middle of your novel. It's an extremely iconic figure, and it gives yourself a big difficulty actually as a writer from the start. It creates an obstacle for yourself because so many of your readers are going to open the book with an idea of how this person should sound. We know what John Lennon sounds, and so it took a lot of years and a lot of drafts and a lot of miniature nervous breakdowns to get a voice that I was happy with. And he's especially difficult actually because, I mean, I was careful not to do too much research for the book because there's so much material out there on John Lennon and the Beatles. If you open that wardrobe, the whole world falls out. But I did watch lots of interviews from American TV shows in the 1970s. And he has such a capricious voice. It's so changeable in tone. He will go from being very light and charming and funny to very dark and difficult and almost aggressive and paranoid in the beat of a sentence, in the course of a single sentence. So to try and replicate that sense on the page takes a great deal of work and difficulty.
But very challenging, but also very interesting. He's such a difficult character to understand. And clearly he went through a lot of suffering in his own life. So engaging in that space, navigating that space and trying to understand it both as a writer and also as I suppose, a human being, that must have been a very complex. Yeah,
and I guess in some ways I approached it a little in the way that an actor might approach a role, you know, and how do you get at the essence of this person. I liked him as much at the end of the process of writing a novel as I did at the beginning. So that says something that it was a valuable piece for me. I was never happier to get a book out of the house, actually, because I started in this kind of glow of glee and delight. What a fantastic idea to put John Lennon in my novel. And after about 2 weeks, the tears started at the desk. I found this is so very difficult, really. So, and I couldn't listen to the music for 4 years while I was writing the book in an unself-conscious way, because I was constantly thinking, am I getting this in any way right? Is this in any way true to this great artist? And he was a very great artist and a very important cusp figure, I believe, in 20th century popular culture. The world was different culturally after John Lennon than it was before him. He was a very interesting figure in that way. So it was a big ask, as they say, to try and get this voice onto the page.
Before I get to read, I'm just curious, what was that like, letting John Lennon go and go out, and your imagined John Lennon go out into the reading public?
It was terrifying, actually, because there are a lot of fans out there. And he's their hero, and rightly so, and how are they going to react? I've been delighted I seem to have got away with the book to some degree, so I've been very relieved, and the reviews and so forth were very kind. One American review actually did say that Kevin doesn't really write novels, he writes radio plays, and I think there's an element of truth in that, because it's written unashamedly in quite a high style, and it's a prose that's kind of meant to be heard as much as it is to be read.
We might get you to read.
Okay, what a link. How I built up that link is just beautiful. I'm just going to read the first couple of pages from the novel Beetlebone. I'm going to apologise in advance for all the dreadful language. John is coming to visit his island in County Mayo, and he's just arrived and set foot on the place in the middle of the night, and he's been driven out there. He sets out for the place as an animal might, as though on some fated migration. There is nothing rational about it, nor even entirely sane, and this is the great attraction. He's been travelling half the night east, and nobody has seen him. If you keep your eyes down, they can't see you. Across the strung-out skies and through the eerie airports, and now he sits in the back of the old Mercedes. His brain feels like a city centre, and there's a strange tingling in the bones of his monkey feet. Fuck it. He will deal with it. The road unfurls as a black tongue and laps at the night. Something monkeyish, isn't there, about his feet? Also his gums are bleeding. But he won't worry about that now. He'll worry about it in a bit, save one for later. Trees and fields pass by in the grainy night. Monkeys on the fucking brain lately, as a matter of fact. Anxiety. He hears a blue yonderly note from somewhere. Perhaps it's from within. Now the driver's somber eyes show up in the rear view. It's arranged, he says. There should be no bother whatsoever. We could be talking an hour yet to the hotel out there. Driver has a very smooth timbre, deep and trustworthy, like a newscaster. The bass note and brown velvet of his voice are the corduroy of it, and the great chunky old Merc cuts the air quiet as money as they move. John is tired, but not for sleeping. No fucking pressmen, he says, and no fucking photogs. In the near dark, there is the sense of trees and fields and hills combining. The way you can feel a world form around you on a lucky night in the springtime. He rolls the window an inch. He takes a lungful of cool starlight for a straightener. Blue and gases, that's lovely. He is tired as fuck, but he cannot get his head down. It's the Maytime, the air is thick with and tastes of it, and he's all stirred up again. Where the fuck are we, driver? It will be very hard to say. He quite likes this driver. He stretches out his monkey toes. It's the middle of the night and nowhere. He sighs heavily, which starts out well enough, but turns quickly to a dull moaning. Not a handsome development. Drivers up the rear view, as though to say, gather yourself. For a moment, they watch each other gravely. The night moves. The driver has a high purple colour, madness or eczema, and his nose looks dead, and he speaks now in a scolding hush. That's going to get you nowhere. Driver tips the wheel. The road is turned. They're moving fast and west. Mountains climb the night sky. The coal stars travel. They are getting higher. The air changes all the while. By a scatter of woods there is a medieval scent. By a deserted house on a sudden turn there is an occult air. How to explain these fucking things? They come at last by the black gleaming sea, and this place is so haunted, or at least it is for me, and there is a sadness too, close in, like a dampened second skin. Out here, the trees have been twisted and shaped by the wind into strange new guises. You can see witches, ghouls, creatures of nightwood, pouting banshees, cackling hoods. It's a night for the fucking bats, he says. I beg your pardon? What I mean to say, driver, is I'm going off my fucking bean back here. I'm sorry? That's all you can be. He lies back in his seat, pale and wakeful, chalk-white comedian, his sore bones and age. No peace, no sleep, no meaning. And the sea is out there and moving. He hears it drag on its cables, a slow, rusted swooning, which is poetical to a man in the dark hours, in his denim, and lonely. It moves him. The driver turns, smiling sadly. You have the look of a poor fellow who's caught up in himself. Oh, what's it's on your mind? Not easy to say, driver. Love, blood, fate, death, sex, devoid, mother, father, cunt and prick. These are the things on his mind. Also, how many more times are they going to ask me come on the fucking Muppet Show? I just want to get to my island, he says. Thank you.
Bravo. Apologising for the language there, and I find that quite amusing.
Okay.
But I suppose we have to live with the reality that we are all in some form of cultural straitjacket from time to time. But I'm just wondering, is it the language that is making it all so human and so understandable to a broad audience? Like this book is now being translated into Spanish. I think it is traveling the world, and it, you know, the conversations in it, the dialogue is uniquely Irish in one way.
Yeah.
It's also very John Lennon in another way.
I think I'm difficult to translate in a very direct fashion. I was just in Barcelona last week. It just came out in Catalan and in Spanish, Beetlebone. God knows what it's like in these wonderful languages. I do know with my Catalan translator, I had quite a long, engaged process. And I knew by the questions he was sending me that he got it. You can tell by the questions. And he had also translated the previous novel, City of Bohan, which would be an even more difficult translation, I think, because lots of it is just in a made-up language. I don't think I'm possible as a writer to be directly translated. It has to be a version of what I'm trying in the book. And again, so much of it is designed as an oral experience, really. And when I was recording the audiobook for Beetlebone, it was very evident to me that this was the real fruition of the project. The ultimate fruition of it was as a story to be told and a story to be listened to.
How much of the book was a sort of self-investigation, I suppose, into where you are as a writer, as an artist, as you know, and the cultural spaces that you want to engage in?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it goes back to the thing of the borders breaking down. Since my first book of stories came out, actually in 2007, it became evident to me very clearly that people like to listen to the stories and like to hear them read. And it became evident to me that I was kind of a frustrated actor myself, who you may have noticed. And it's very interesting, actually, that I love a project that pushes you in unexpected directions. And 2 of the 9 sections of Beetlebone are essentially small play texts. And since I finished the book, I've been writing plays, and it pushed me in those directions. It became so startlingly obvious that my work was trying to get into the form of a drama for the stage, and even I couldn't miss it, you know. You can be very dumb often about your own work. It can take a while to figure out what you're up to yourself. It can take years before you figure out what prompted you to write your novels or to write your stories or plays. But it's and I guess writers never have much of a plan, really, when they get to certainly in my case, when I get to the desk and begin a project like this, I have only a very vague idea of where it's going, and I almost treat it as a kind of, with prose fiction, I almost treat it as a musical form. I believe every story has an inherent melody or tune. and you're really just trying to hear it as you go along, sentence by sentence by sentence. And something I read when I was in my early 20s and trying to work at fiction for the first time in a serious, dedicated way. I remember coming across an interview with the great American novelist Don DeLillo, in which he said he was something that was very interesting to me at the time. He said, I'm perfectly prepared to change the meaning of a sentence for the sake of how it sounds. What I'm really interested, I've discovered, is the sound and the rhythm of the prose. And I remember reading that and kind of sitting up with a starting gun. That's exactly how I feel about it. And discovering also that, you know, your stories can be treated almost like a song as you write them. And I actually have a theory that very often writers are failed musicians, are really bad singers, and it's a kind of a displacement activity that you do because you can't do something else.
I might ask you actually about Bob Dylan later, and it was touched on by the panel earlier, and there's been a lot of furore about it. But as I was rereading Beetlebone this week, I was also reading another biography, actually, of another great British artist, Victorian landscape portrait or landscape artist, Turner. And there are some crazy parallels between Turner's life and John Lennon's life. Turner lost two sisters when he was very, very young. His mother wasn't institutionalized, had chronic mental health issues. Turner had massive anxiety and a lot of self-doubt, yet he was clearly very brilliant. You have picked John Lennon, who has a lot of similar traits. He was also a spellbinding and hugely iconic figure. I'm just wondering, are all artists, are they all troubled, or do we ever get happy artists?
No.
Is it part of the light and the shadow? Is it part of the whole deal?
I think a difficult, unhappy childhood is a prerequisite for artists almost. No, and it's as I was writing Beetlebone, and you're trying to create a portrait of an artist, and you're trying to give a likeness on the page, and you bring everything you can from your own life and experience to it. So it was really interesting to me when I started to write what's essentially an essay in the center of the book about me writing a novel. Why am I doing this? Those paragraphs started to come very easily and effortlessly, with a sense of the hand being guided on the page. And up until this, nothing had been effortless about this novel. It had been very hard work. And I found emotional material from my own life coming into the story, about how I had lost a family member young, and he had also. So that was a resonance I could work with. And you just take whatever you can get. And it's very interesting, actually, to talk about Turner or something like that. That the writer with a happy childhood would be a rare and marvellous beast.
But it seems like a continuum in art, in music, in literature and poetry. It's you wrote something very curious in the book. It was actually in the more memoir period of the book, and I imagine it was a huge risk putting it on the page, and a lot of your readers have a certain expectation of you or the type of writer that you are. You wrote that, and I'm rephrasing it here, and maybe you can recorrect me, that either whatever you're uncomfortable with or whatever you're scared of or unsure of, that it will follow you in your fiction, that you come up close to it.
I think I actually stole the quote, the phrase from somewhere. It's whatever you're most afraid of in your work, you can rest assured that it's nearby. And I think something I've always been terrified of finding in my stories or in my work is any kind of sentiment, any kind of sentimental note. But actually I think these can be very interesting places. And I've become very interested in, if your response to your own work sometimes is embarrassment, that's a very interesting place to be. I think as a younger writer, as an emerging writer, when you read back over your stories, you come across that stuff where you recoil in horror from the page and you immediately cut it out because it embarrasses you. I'm increasingly in a place now where I'm cutting everything except the stuff that embarrasses me. Often the stuff that embarrasses you is the interesting stuff. It's the true stuff. It's very often stuff that you've drawn from your own family life, or from people close to you, or from your own life history. And that's why your immediate impulse is, get it off the page. But no, cut everything else and look at that. Shame is a very interesting experience at the writing desk.
A very powerful experience, absolutely, I would imagine, for a writer.
To go back, happiness writes white. Iris Murdoch says it doesn't show up on the page. It's a very uninteresting topic.
What about chaos?
Yeah, The difficulty of writing about chaos is you have a very difficult property to control on the page. But interestingly, with John Lennon, you're trying to describe a brilliant artist at a time of creative difficulty in his life, when his sources of inspiration were changing, when he wasn't really writing songs. And I had a weird image in my mind of what I wanted the experience to be like for a reader of this novel. I kept picturing a deep fat fryer in a good Dublin chipper, and the way it's lowered down into that sizzling boiling cauldron of fat. And I thought, that's what I want this book to feel like, that you're plonked down into the middle of this intense consciousness, this really intense man. And it's going to be, for a while at least, an unsettling experience. And I knew because of that I had to put space into the book as well. So typographically, actually, it's laid out with lots of white space between the sentences and between the paragraphs, because I wanted to get some air onto the page of this very dense, in places, text. It started to work for me as a novel. It kind of stood up on my desk when I gave him a sidekick, when I made him part of a double act. So this driver, who we meet very early, becomes his kind of spiritual guide to County Mayo and its strange occult properties. And when I could hear this driver's voice, suddenly I could start to hear John's voice much better in relief against it, once I made him this double act. And I realised at this point that it was the most old-fashioned novel in the world. It was essentially Don Quixote. It was, tilting at windmills and the meaning of life and all of that. But yeah, once I got him talking to this strange County Mayo van driver in the book, he seemed to become a three-dimensional character for me.
You're saying there roughly, if I've got it right, that Cornelius, your character there, that he toned it down a bit. He gave a bit of lightness, he gave a bit of warmth, a bit of humanity and so on. Do you think that the reader can take it, or wouldn't be able to take it if you had not put him in there? Do you think that, you know, how we're looking at readers, or that we are not understanding maybe that they have it in them to read stuff?
No, I don't think so. I think certainly in publishing or in mainstream publishing, there is a tendency away from difficulty. But I actually think readers are perfectly prepared to go with difficult texts. I wanted the book, though, to have... We have music. Wow, fabulous.
Will we have dancing?
I wanted the book to have not so much a sense of plot turning too much, but what I call thumb. I wanted it to move lightly, and I wanted it to move quite easily on the page. Okay. And these long dialogues between John and Cornelius, I think, get that sense of movement into the book. Long dialogues about nothing, absolutely nothing whatsoever, but that were great fun to break up the more kind of jagged or raw parts of the story.
Is it in those long dialogues so that we can ask the big questions, dark or otherwise?
Oh, for sure, yeah. And it becomes a very kind of haunted exploration, I think, for both of them as they travel deeper into County Mayo, as it always does for me. I live very nearby. I live in County Sligo. So actually, strangely enough, this novel was written on location, almost out around the places it describes. I go cycling out there in the summer, and weirdly enough, it was the feeling of the place as much as an idea about John Lennon and his island that made me want to write this book. Anytime I've cycled out around Clew Bay and looking down all these little islands that are lost in the mist down there, I've always got this very kind of haunted, melancholy feeling of that place, and I wanted that to be the atmosphere of the novel. And you need that as well as the characters and everything else. I very much work from place and geography. Almost always the initial spark or idea for a story is the place and some resonance that I'm drawing from the place.
So you're writing from a sense of home then, is it?
I guess it's just a sense that all our places have their own distinct reverberations and airs and feelings, and the way that human feeling settles into our places, and how I just wanted to get some of that sort of that sort of reverb onto the page, and I thought, for some mad reason, I thought it was true to his. I hoped that the book would be true to his spirit. It was interesting, actually. After about a year, the book took 4 years, but after about a year, I thought I was getting the voice. I thought this is quite convincing. You could believe that this is John Lennon But then I realised that this was a very dangerous moment actually for the book, because I could have done the kind of standard biopic, you know, I could have done a standard kind of lightly fictionalised biographical piece. And I thought, actually, he was a very, for a long period of his working life, he was a very wild and inventive artist, especially around late 60s, early 70s. He kind of went more mainstream at the end. But I thought, if it's to be true to him, it should be it should have a kind of a wild and a jagged feeling to it itself as a book.
And clearly, within all of that, suffering was a way of being for John Lennon, and it worked to him.
And I
to
guess
a certain degree.
the great cosmic joke really is that when we're happy, we don't have any art. In his actual life around this time, he was very dry. He wasn't writing any songs. The well was dry, and he kind of thought the problem was he was too happy. His marriage was in a good place again. He had a new baby. His visa difficulties in the United States had eased, and suddenly he had no songs. So the book really was imagining him going to Ireland to put himself in trouble and see if that would work. And it did. He got a new record out of it.
I'm just wondering, if we all in this room can learn from books as readers, and we can educate ourselves and broaden our minds and reach out to lots of different places and lots of different countries and different experiences, presumably a writer also learns. So what did you learn?
From the book, this book, I learned actually that my present ambition at the writing desk probably doesn't at the moment rest in the novel as a form. This book was definitely pushing me towards the stage drama and towards the essay, towards the long personal essay as forms. And since I finished over a year ago, that's where I've been, and that's where I'm at. I'm sure I'll return to the novel at some point, but for now I'm very interested in doing work that gets me out of the house and gives me some colleagues for a while. Because when you're writing these novels for 4 years, you're in a little shed in County Sligo, looking out at the rain, going fucking nuts, going slowly crazy. And I just thought, you know what, it's really nice to go to a rehearsal room sometimes and talk to actors and have coffee and do all of that. It's more sociable. And by my nature, I'm quite a sociable person. And actually my own background as a writer in my 20s was in journalism as a freelancer, and that gets you out of the house and you move around. And I really missed that when I was suddenly this person in a shed in County Sligo, you know, looking out at the rain and trying to deal with it. So it's I'm enjoying a nice kind of break at the moment from the novel as a form.
And if and when you fall asleep tonight, Kevin,
actually John Lennon was a wonderful insomniac, and this is another thing all great artists have. They can't sleep very well, and of course I'm always asked now what's my favourite John Lennon song, and it's I'm So Tired on the White Album. And actually I believe that he thought himself it was one of his nicest vocal performances, and it's the Insomniac's great anthem. It's a wonderful song.
Well, in a deranged bout of tiredness and chaos and all of that, you fall asleep tonight, you wake up and you fall back asleep, and for some strange reason John Lennon comes into your head, or he comes into your dream. What are you going to ask him?
Oh God.
And maybe what was left out within this book?
Yeah, do you know what, it was very interesting though as I was writing it. And like I was a kid in the 1970s in the west of Ireland, so I have my own sense memories of that period. It's very interesting actually, when the west of Ireland shows up in our literature, usually it's about the farm or about the small town. But when I was growing up in the west of Ireland, it was full of freaks, and it was full of hippie communes and primal scream cults and streaker cults. All crazy energies had come into the place in the 1970s. And it was really fun to discover that John Lennon had a very concrete role in that. He gave his island to the first organised commune in the west of Ireland, a polyamorous commune called the Diggers, a free love outfit. And he was a very mischievous person. He was very interested at bringing new energies into places. And up until this point, up until the early 70s, the west of Ireland was white Catholic monolith as a culture. And when all the freaks came in, I really think that they improved the place greatly. And it was nice to think that John had a place in that. What I would like to ask him actually is...
You're dreaming now, remember, so you can think bigger.
Well, I think something I saw in an interview with Yoko Ono in the very recent past was that she said John considered himself to be a devout Irishman. And I'd like to talk to him about the extent of his Irishness.
It's something that was picked up earlier tonight in here, and it was about Bob Dylan.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you got some of it. I was away in Rwanda last week in a very different part of the world, and I came back and flew in early last Friday morning, and I turned on Ryan Tuberty on RTE, and there was all this talk about Bob Dylan and whether he deserved the Nobel Prize for Literature, and I just thought it was very negative in ways. I thought that possibly a little bit intellectually snobby, and that the theme here tonight is about borders and looking at barriers and creativity. Our theme earlier was looking at, words and opening up words. Is it all a little negative?
I was quite puzzled by it, actually, and I would be very much in favour of him getting the Nobel Prize for Literature. And poems were originally written to be sung. Songwriting is the oldest poetical form. Nobody can say he hasn't moved people immensely with his work. Certainly as a kind of a depressed teenager, his work was very special to me. And as for something, I do think, you can look at, if it was going to go to an American writer this year, you could say he's of the same age and generation as someone like Don DeLillo or Philip Roth, who are truly great novelists, and they all deserve it too. But no, I liked it. I liked the gesture of it. I'm sure lots of people would argue that it should be Leonard Cohen, and I'd almost lean towards that camp, maybe. But I liked it, and I thought it was, prizes are strange, crazy things anyway, and they're very subjective. But I was surprised by it. I don't think anyone was really expecting it, and I was very happy about it.
But whether Don DeLillo or Philip Roth or lots of different writers deserved it, that doesn't preclude another writer, poet, thinker, artist from getting it.
Yeah, but
he said himself that that it's so hard to define poetry. He said that he has lived and will die like a poet. So maybe we just need to be a little bit more curious about what literature is, and be a bit more open to the fluidity. I think David earlier on made the point in relation to, I think there's a Lingo Festival on this weekend.
Dave Lordan's festival.
Should we not just open up to all of this and be a little bit more?
I think so. I mean, I think it's a hugely interesting time creatively because all those borders are falling away. My wife Olivia and I have a journal called Winter Papers, and just in its second year now, and we noticed last year it has short stories and essays and graphic stories and poems and everything, and it's become really difficult this year, we noticed, to state which category something is in, because fiction and non-fiction.
But what's wrong with that?
This is great. It's wonderful. It's giddy times, and times of flux creatively. So it's a really interesting time for artists, I think. And the way we tell stories and the way we deliver narratives is changing very quickly. But it's not something. I have no fear. Like, people worry about the novel and the short story, and I have no fear about any of that. I don't think there's any danger that storytelling is going to disappear. It's among our most fundamental human needs, because our lives are shapeless and meaningless and cruel and horrible and miserable often, and we need stories to give them shape and to give them meaning and to give them a sense of structure. The way we deliver our stories will change, but the need to tell stories won't.
Well, on that point, I might open it out to the floor. Does anyone have any questions for Kevin? Anybody? Great.
Sorry, just come back to Bob Dylan again.
Yeah.
I think there is the suggestion, whether it's true or not, that Bob Dylan may have rejected the prize.
Just today, I think. Is there this coming out?
Yeah, that's what I've seen.
I saw a reference to that, yeah.
Because of Nobel's activity in relation to arms dealing and explosives, Whether that's true, I don't know.
It would be very interesting. I've seen the Nobel Committee state before that it's not possible to refuse the Nobel Prize. They kind of give it to you anyway. You go down on the annals, as happened with Goddard. Was it who refused it in '64? Yeah. Sartre refused it in '64, but they still.
Did also, did he?
He did in '60. Yeah. But they still declared him the recipient, even though he had refused it. It would be very interesting, and it would, maybe for Dylan, that would be a very interesting use to make of the award, to open up the debate about the background of the prize. You know,
it seems he's determined to be silent about it. It would seem. Just you mentioned in the being confined to the shed. With new technology, can you do it on the move, or is it very much being in the one place in that environment?
I think so. It's especially with a longer project like a novel, it's very difficult work. And while you can kind of make notes and so forth as you drift around and sketch out scenes, I definitely do need the kind of quiet, rainy weeks in Sligo to just have a real run at something, you know. But yeah, I mean, I by accident kind of ended up living in County Sligo 9 years ago, almost 10 years ago now, and it turns out to be a great place for a writer to be based, because there's not much going on for a lot of the year out there, you know, not much else to do. But it's where you base yourself as a writer turns out to be a really important decision in a writing life. It really influences your work over the years. It really influences the material, and it's not something you really think about, you know, at the time when you decide to buy a house in a swamp in South County Sligo. But I can feel it creeping into the work now after 8 or 9 or 10 years, how the place is starting to inform the work more and more. But yeah, it's.
So if we put you in New York, we get a very different Kevin Barry, do you think?
Oh, I'm sure. And I often thought about, for example, somebody like John McGahern, a great Irish writer who lived nearby in County Leitrim. He made a decision to return from Dublin and London and live again in Leitrim in the 1970s. And I think that decision gave us some of his great late work that may not have come if he had remained in a city, or the work would have been very different. So it's a decision that you don't really realise as a creative one, where you're going to put yourself, where you're going to live. That turns out to be often the most important creative decision that you make. And it's a very interesting time for young writers and young artists, as in, where are we going to live? Young writers and artists can't afford the cities anymore. Traditionally, you would go and live in Paris or New York or London. Young writers can't do that now. So I think the future is to go and live in swamps in County Sligo, which are much more affordable. But it is a really interesting difficulty and problem for our bigger cities, I think, that they're pricing out the creative classes, essentially, and that writers and artists and poets can no longer afford to be based in big cities. And what's that going to do to the cultural fabric of those places?
We might take another gentleman here.
Did you have any findings on what John Lennon was reading at that time?
Yeah.
And I mean,
Very interesting question.
Yeah, not only in that time, but when he was younger, or
Yeah.
the Walrus
Right,
time,
yeah.
or even when he was a youngster in Liverpool.
Yeah, he was, as a teenager, he was obsessed with Dylan Thomas as a poet. And that was very important to me in writing this book. I wanted to bring almost some of that sense of kind of a piece like Under Milkwood by Dylan Thomas into the way you would depict this world. He published 2 books himself in the early mid-1960s of prose fragments, really. He very clearly had a great literary talent, but it was kind of unhoned and unpolished. But he was compared to Joyce a lot when these books appeared. And at this point, he went and read Joyce for the first time. He read Finnegan's Wake, or a few pages of it, and he said it sounded like an old friend, but he didn't bother to read any more than those few pages. But he apparently was a voracious poetry reader and fiction reader to a lesser extent. But I think Dylan Thomas remained a kind of a lifelong obsession for him.
Any other questions?
This lady here. Yeah.
At the beginning of your speech, you said the border make things messy and unstable, but it is good. So can you explain, like, in which aspects it becomes messy, stable, and why is it good?
Yeah, I guess I'm speaking kind of metaphorically. Just, I think the interesting places for writers to explore are the places where different entities are kind of colliding and rubbing up against each other and creating sparks. In terms of my own work, the border I'm very interested in, I think, is the place between reality and something that goes a little bit different to that. So I'm really interested in working out on the very edge of kind of believability as a writer. I tell very tall tales in the books, and I'm trying to bring the reader along page by page where they're just about believing this stuff, where they're just about going with it, because that's a very interesting place. That kind of the cusp of believability is a very interesting place to work, and it's risky. You know, you're always aware that you're on a kind of a cliff edge when you write in a place where suddenly talking seals are appearing, as happens in Beetlebone or something like that, because you have to convince the reader to go with it. But yeah, in terms of my own work, those are the kind of borders I'm looking at. Thanks. Yes. Hey.
Hello, thank you so much for the introduction of the book. I would like to tell you that my first introduction to John Lennon came when I was studying in the university. I had this huge graffiti of the song Imagine in my university, and when I read the lyrics, I had to tell myself that, I have to go back and read what it's all about. Yeah. So I was like, this was a fantastic person who was talking music, who was talking peace. But then, I came across an article where there was a grey streak, or rather a black streak to his character, where you hear instances where he abused women, and he even was allegedly in this case where he abused his wife, and his son, his wife Cynthia was alleged that, he used to emotionally abuse her. And then there was an instance where he mocked some disabled people, and instances like that. So in a situation like that, when you are in your growing age and you're looking up to some fabulous artist who's not only an artist but an activist in his own sense, and then you hear about instances like these. So this kind of creates disappointment in the youth.
Sure.
Yeah. So I would just like to ask if you have talked about that dimension of his character in this book.
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of allegations, of course, are made to him in many biographies and so forth. He tended to, in his biographers, it tended to inspire very contradictory impulses. They were either hugely in love with him or total hatchet jobs. I'm sure the actual truth was somewhere in the middle. Certainly, he's a complicated figure. He's difficult. He's thorny. Certainly, when you look at old interviews of him, he comes across as paranoid. Sometimes as very aggressive. And then again, inside that beat of a sentence, suddenly lyric and a beautiful-minded person. So it's very hard. Our favourite artists are never easy. Are never saints. I think. I don't think some of the wilder claims that were made against him have a huge basis in fact. There were a couple of very notorious biographies that turned out later to be very stretched in the way they were using the material. But certainly he wasn't a saint. He wasn't a perfect idol by any means. But he was a very interesting character to write about.
Just to follow up on that point, have you made life very difficult for yourself, I wonder? Because, he's such a monumental character and such a fascinating character. So how do you follow up on that?
Yeah.
Like City of Bohan, you had such an incredibly raw and vibrant society that you imagined with these incredible characters, that had its own energy. We have John Lennon with his own thing going on there. So I'm just wondering, how have you set the task so high now?
I always have an ambition to write a very quiet, thoughtful novel, and it always goes mad inside about a page and a half. I don't know. I'm really enjoying working on the little plays at the moment. First one is going to be on in Dublin in February, actually, in the project. But it's I don't know. When I do go back into the next novel, I'm not sure what it's going to be at this point. Whether, in fact, it might turn out to be a kind of a long essay, I don't know. Right, but we'll see soon enough.
Can we take one more question?
Hi.
Long time ago, you talked about the covers of your books and how they differ here in Europe and in the UK, in the US. Can you talk about the cover of your book as translated into Spanish or Catalan? Have you seen it?
I have. It's very beautiful, actually. They've used an image of Lennon, a portrait of him, adrift in a sea of the west of Ireland. I love this, the Irish and UK cover from Canada. It's quite an abstracted image. And I was trying to push it on my American publisher as well, and they were having none of it. They wanted a very, a representation of him. And I just said, please don't do the spectacles. I don't want the spectacles, that's a cliche. So every cover they sent me had the spectacles up front. I eventually got them to remove his spectacles, but that was as far as it went. But I was happy with it. It's quite an abstracted portrait of him. But I really like this one. It's strange and it's kind of odd, and you're not sure what's going on. And I like the kind of mystery of it. Thank you.
Last final question, if you don't mind, Kevin. You were just saying there a minute ago that you were writing from a sense of place, and you're saying that a few years ago you buy this house and what an impact it's had cycling around and the whole psychogeography of the area, if you will. I'm just wondering, books presumably play a part too. So all the different books that you're reading, and how influential are they or not to how you're imagining the world? I
think it's what's very important actually in any writer's life is there's a period in your late teens and early 20s, I think, and it's the stuff that you read then that becomes the real influence on all the work that comes after. And the influences that go in at that age, when your brain is like a sponge, it's your most important reading time in
what were you
your
reading
life.
then?
I was reading, I was reading too narrowly, actually. I didn't read broadly enough, I think. I was reading The Great American Jews. I loved Philip Roth and Saul Bellow, and I was convinced I was the next great Jewish American novelist, and that didn't work out at all. And I would tend to get bogged down in a writer. I would get obsessed with a writer, Flannery O'Connor stories, and just read Flannery O'Connor stories for a year. And of course then you try and ape that style on the page. I think for young writers it's very important to read very broadly, all different forms, all different genres. As a reader now, I start so many books, and I have always 20 or 30 books onside the bed. I love to read poetry, and I try to read some poetry every day. Or every night. I think for a prose writer, poetry keeps your ear in tune at some level.
Well, Kevin, thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan.
Before we wrap up, I'd just like to thank Miriam and Lara at the festival for organising quite an interesting range of speakers. I'd also like to thank, on behalf of the Institute, festival sponsors and the diplomatic presence here tonight. So from everyone in the festival, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Susan.
Thank you.